Has your child ever said something that stopped you in your tracks? Maybe your 3-year-old started telling you about the family they had before they were born. Maybe your child talks about angels, guides, or people that you can't see. Maybe they seem to know things they shouldn't possibly know. Or perhaps, like my daughter, they started making unusual sounds as a toddler that sounded almost like another language. And you found yourself quietly wondering, what is going on with my child? Where is this coming from? And maybe there's an even quieter voice inside you saying, there is something different about this child. If you felt that, this episode is for you. Because today we're talking about new earth children, the spiritually aware, deeply sensitive, and intuitive children who seem to be arriving with an incredible level of awareness already intact. And we're going to explore a much bigger question. Why are so many of these children being born now? And perhaps even more importantly, why did they choose you to be their mum? Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Rainbow Children of the Light. I'm Heather Bell. I'm a children's energy healer and channel, and I support spiritual mums raising sensitive, intuitive, and neurodivergent children to understand their children on a deeper level and create more peace, confidence, and connection within their families. And I'm really excited about today's conversation because this is something that's very close to my heart. We're talking about new earth children. Now, before we go any further, I want to say that I'm sharing this from a spiritual perspective. You don't need to believe every part of this. You don't need to put a label on your child. And you certainly don't need to decide that every unusual thing your child says or does has a spiritual explanation. I simply want to offer you another lens because sometimes when we look at our children through a different lens, suddenly things that didn't make sense before begin to make a little more sense. And if you've always had that quiet feeling that there is something different about your child, I want you to know that it's okay to be curious about that feeling. So let's start here. What exactly is a new earth child? When I use the term new earth children, I'm talking about children who, from a spiritual perspective, appear to be incarnating with a very strong connection to their intuition, their sensitivity, and sometimes their spiritual awareness. You may have heard different terms used over the years: indigo children, crystal children, rainbow children, star children, and there are lots of different beliefs around what each of those labels mean. But for me, the label isn't actually the important part. The child in front of you is. Because what we're seeing in many children is an incredible sensitivity to the world around them. They might be deeply affected by people's emotions. They might notice the energy of a room immediately. They might have an enormous amount of empathy. They may be very intuitive. They may talk about things that we would consider spiritual without anybody having taught them about those things. Some children talk about angels. Some people talk about people who have passed. Some seem to have memories that sound like another lifetime. Some make sounds or speak what their parents describe as light language. Some have incredibly vivid dreams, and others don't talk about anything obviously spiritual at all. There may be simply this feeling about them, a depth, a sensitivity, a sense that they just perceive the world differently. And for many mums, there's this feeling of, I know there's something going on here, I just don't have the words for it. And this brings us to a bigger question. Well, why now? Why do we seem to be seeing so many incredibly sensitive, intuitive, and spiritually open children? From a spiritual perspective, I believe we're living through a huge shift in consciousness. For generations, humanity has carried enormous amounts of conditioning, beliefs about who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to behave, what success looks like, what a family should look like, what emotions are acceptable, how children should behave, what spirituality should look like. And so many of us adults have spent years undoing those things. We've had to learn how to listen to ourselves again. We've had to learn boundaries. We've had to reconnect with our bodies. We've had to heal ancestral patterns. We've had to question beliefs that were handed down to us. And we've had to learn that sensitivity isn't necessarily weakness. We've had to rediscover intuition after spending years being told to ignore it. In many ways, we've had to unlearn before we could remember who we were. But what if some of the children arriving now don't need to spend decades doing that? What if some of them are arriving with that connection already much more intact? That's one of the ways I understand New Earth children. I don't see them as children who have come here needing to spend half their lifetime undoing everything before they can begin stepping into who they became to be. I see many of them arriving ready to question, ready to create, ready to bring compassion, ready to challenge systems that no longer serve humanity, ready to think differently, ready to connect differently, and ultimately ready to contribute to a different way of living on Earth. And there's something really important I want to say here. When I talk about these children having a greater purpose or contributing to the consciousness of the earth, that doesn't mean your child needs to become a healer. They don't need to be a channel. They don't need to become a spiritual teacher. They don't need to save humanity. And they certainly don't need that responsibility placed on their shoulders as children. Their contribution might look completely ordinary from the outside. Maybe they grow up and create more compassionate way of teaching children. Maybe they care deeply about animals. Maybe they invent something. Maybe they challenge an outdated system. Maybe they're an artist, a scientist, a farmer, a parent. Maybe they simply refuse to continue a pattern that has existed within a family for generations. Raising consciousness doesn't necessarily mean standing on a stage talking about spirituality. Sometimes it means living differently. And I think that's an important distinction because these children are still children. They need to play, they need to make mess, they need to climb trees, they need to laugh, they need to experience their childhood. Their purpose can unfold in its own time. So now we get to the part that I think so many mums need to hear. Perhaps you've looked at your child and thought, why me? Why did this incredibly sensitive child come to me? Why am I raising the child who doesn't fit the mold? Why am I the mum having conversations about things none of my friends seem to be talking about? And spiritually, I don't think these things appeared accidentally. Many of the mums raising these children have already been doing their own inner work. Maybe you've been breaking patterns within your own family. Maybe you've been learning to trust your intuition. Maybe you've explored spirituality. Maybe you've questioned the way you were parented. Maybe you've started healing things that have been passed down through generations. Maybe you're learning about nervous system regulation. Maybe you've realized that the old way of forcing children to comply doesn't feel right anymore. You may not feel particularly evolved. You may still lose your patience. You may still question yourself. You may still have days where you think, I have absolutely no idea what I am doing. And that's okay. We've all been there. Your child doesn't need you to be a perfectly healed mother. They don't need you to know everything about spirituality. Perhaps they simply needed a mum who's willing to say, there might be another way. A mum who would listen, a mum who would question, a mum who would be curious, a mum who wouldn't automatically shut down something simply because she couldn't explain it. And maybe that's a part of why you're together. And this brings me to something that happened in my own family. When my daughter was a toddler, she used to make these really unusual sounds. And it wasn't just the normal babbling, there was something very distinct about it. It sounded like a language, but obviously it wasn't a language that I recognized. At the time, I didn't know anything about light language. This is well before I started my journey. So I didn't look at her and think, oh, she's speaking light language. I just thought she was making these strange little noises because that's what toddlers do. And, life moved on. And so years later, I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across a woman who was channeling all different types of light language. And when she connected with a particular star being, when I heard it, I stopped. It just completely halted me in my tracks because I knew that sound. I had heard it well before. And suddenly I was taken straight back to when my daughter was a toddler. Those strange little sounds that I hadn't understood at the time had possibly another meaning. And whether someone else would interpret that experience in exactly the same way, isn't really the point. What mattered to me was what it taught me. Sometimes we don't understand what our children are showing us when they're showing it to us. Sometimes understanding comes years later. And sometimes perhaps we never completely understand it. But I realized that my job wasn't necessarily to explain everything. My job was to remain open. And that really changed the way I parent, because now when my children say something unusual, my first response isn't necessarily, oh, that isn't real, or you're imagining things, or even, oh, I know exactly what that is. Instead, I've learnt to become curious. And one of the most powerful things we can say to a child in these moments is just incredibly simple. Tell me more. And that's it. Tell me more. Because we look at what happens when we do that. We're not dismissing them, but we're also not putting our interpretation onto their experience. We're just giving them space. If your child says, Mummy, there's a lady standing beside my bed, you don't necessarily need to say, that's your spirit guide. But you also don't immediately have to say, no, there isn't. You can simply say, well, tell me about that lady. What does she look like? How do you feel when she's there? What happens when you see her? And then just listen. That gives your child permission to explore their own experience without us creating the story for them. So, what are some of the things mums might actually notice? One is usually knowing. Your child may seem to know something they weren't told. Another might be talking about what sounds like another lifetime. Young children sometimes tell incredibly detailed stories about where they lived or who they were before. Some children may talk about angels, guides, or loved ones who have passed. Some children may make unusual sounds or what their family interprets as light language. Some children have incredibly vivid dreams. Others seem very aware of people's emotions. They might walk into a room and immediately notice that something feels different. They may be incredibly sensitive to conflict. I know I certainly was. They may feel overwhelmed in busy environments. They may have a deep connection with animals or nature. And sometimes their awareness isn't expressed in words at all. They might simply have always felt, you know, my child experiences the world differently, and that's just how it is. And because I speak to so many mums raising neurodivergent children, I want to touch on this as well. We don't have to choose between understanding our children neurologically, emotionally, physically, or spiritually. Different lenses can coexist. If your child is autistic or has ADHD, understanding their sensory system, nervous system, communication, and individual support needs is incredibly important. Spirituality doesn't replace those things, and neurodivergent doesn't automatically mean that an experience is spiritual either. But if spirituality is a part of your family's worldview, you may find that having a spiritual lens alongside those practical understandings helps you to relate to your child in a deeper way. We can remain grounded and curious. Those things don't have to contradict one another. There's another side of this conversation that I think is incredibly important. If your child does show intuitive or spiritual awareness, they don't need to perform it for us. If your child tells you that they can see angels, we don't need to ask them at every, family gathering or whenever they walk into a space, tell grandma what you can see. If they pull an oracle card and say something profound, they don't need to prove that they can do it again tomorrow. If they tell you something unusual, we don't need to turn it into their identity. Because once we start expecting something from a child, it's very easy for their natural experience to become mixed with wanting to please us. So our role isn't necessarily to develop their gifts as quickly as possible. It's to create an environment where the natural awareness is allowed to exist without fear, without pressure, without performance, and without us deciding what it has to become. So if you're listening to this thinking, okay, Heather, I think this might be my child, what do I actually do? Start incredibly simply. Listen, get curious, write down some of the things they say if you want to remember them. Try not to interrogate them, try not to immediately interpret everything too, and give them opportunities to connect with themselves, because nurturing intuition isn't necessarily about teaching children how to see angels or channel information. It's often much simpler. It's helping them recognize, what does my body tell me? What do I feel? What do I notice? What feels right for me? What helps me feel grounded and safe? And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next episode. I'm going to share 7 gentle ways you can nurture your child's natural intuition without telling them what to believe. We'll talk about children's oracle cards and the simple way I use them with my own children. I'll show you a really fun grounding exercise. We'll talk about body yes and body no. I'll show you how we can help children clear and protect their energy in a way that feels safe rather than fearful. And I'm going to share one of my favorites, shaking like a wet puppy. Kids love it because spirituality with children doesn't have to be serious. It can be playful, it can be fun, we can make it into games. And before I finish, I also want to mention this because sometimes the mums who find my work aren't necessarily looking for another technique. They're looking for understanding. You might be seeing something happen with your child and think, I just wish I could understand what they're experiencing. And that's one of the reasons I created my children's rainbow recalibration sessions. During one of these sessions, I connect energetically with the child and work through their energetic body, clearing and recalibrating what presents within the session. I also receive channel guidance that can offer another perspective on some of the questions you have about what your child may be experiencing. It's not about putting another label on your child. It's about giving you another layer of information and helping you feel more connected and confident in supporting the child in front of you. If that feels like something your family needs, you'll find more information through the links below. But if there is only one thing you take away from today's episode, I want it to be this: your intuition is worth listening to. Maybe there is something different about your child. Maybe they're here to contribute something beautiful to this changing world. And maybe there's a reason you are the mum walking beside them. You don't have to understand everything they're experiencing. You don't have to have all of the answers. And you certainly don't need to map out their sole purpose for them, as tempting as that is. Sometimes your job is much simpler than that. It's just to stay open, to stay curious, to listen. And when your child tells you something that makes absolutely no sense to your logical mind, instead of immediately explaining it or dismissing it, try the 3 little words: tell me more. So I'll see you on the next episode, where we're going to get really practical and explore the 7 gentle ways to nurture your child's intuition without telling them what to believe. So if you know another spiritual mum who is raising a child who seems to experience the world a little differently, share this episode with her. The more mums get to know this, the better. And if this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear in the comments. Has your child ever said or done something you simply couldn't explain? You don't need to share anything private, just a simple yes. And it just lets other mums know that they're not alone. So thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next episode. Sending so much love to you and your little one.